And I want to thank all of you for being here for this event to talk about the shipping crisis. Uh, CAMPS is really happy to co-sponsor this with AWB. So CAMPS, just for those of you who may not be aware, we're a community of manufacturing leaders that are working to grow manufacturing in the state of Washington, where we love manufacturing. We see the value that it has to our communities and economically. And we're very pleased to be contacted by AWB, who also were very interested in this topic of the shipping crisis and said, hey, why don't we partner on this event? So we're very pleased. AWB is Washington State's oldest and largest business organization, and Tommy is representing them. And I'll turn the time over to her in just a moment, but I wanted to introduce Sean Egan from Washington Seaport Alliance. Now he has dual roles. He'll tell you more about that with the Port of Seattle, Port of Tacoma, and the Northwest Seaport Alliance. I probably got that a little mixed up, Sean, but you'll straighten that out. But you've had some interesting experience. So after Tommy gives us a brief introduction, we'll turn the time over to Sean, and then we've got Mav Sawer here from CMG, who actually will have some perspectives on solutions. And so Marv, we appreciate you being here. Marv represents CMG. They currently have more than $650 million of freight under management. And one of the things that we've really enjoyed getting to know about CMG more is that they're actually saving manufacturers on average 26% on all of their inbound and outbound freight. So Marv's they're a member of CAMPS. We appreciate them being a member of CAMPS. I see Bobby Jones here who represents CMG. So we're going to talk about the problem. We're going to talk about some solutions. And so I'd like to go ahead and turn the time over to Tommy. I want to thank all of you for being here today. So Tommy.
Thank you, Kirk. As you mentioned, we are the state's the state's Chamber of Commerce, and we're the state's oldest and largest business association. We're also recognized as the National Association of Manufacturing as the state's affiliate. My name is Tommy Gantz. I'm the Government Affairs Director for Tax and Fiscal Policy here at the Association of Washington Business. And we're all aware of the severe supply chain disruptions that have been brought on by the pandemic and made much worse by worker shortages. We have a goal in this state of doubling the manufacturing sector over the next 10 years, and figuring out these supply chain issues and labor shortages is critical if we are going to achieve that goal. We look forward to working with CAMPS and other Washington partners, as well as our lawmakers, to move beyond these hurdles. And we are delighted to be partnering with CAMPS on today's webinar. We'll also be continuing this discussion on December 8th at 2 p.m. So please go to awb.org to register. That is listed also in the chat. And I've included my email in the chat as well if anyone has any follow-up questions on that webinar. Thank you again, Kirk, for having us. We really appreciate it.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Sean Egan. I'm here today on the behalf of the Northwest Seaport Alliance, and I want to thank both CAMPS and the Association of Washington Business for holding this important roundtable discussion and talking about some of the challenges within the supply chain. Both organizations are terrific organizations. I personally have had a lot of experience working with the Association of Washington Business. I've had an opportunity to watch Tommy in action. She is a terrific leader within the business community and within the state of Washington, and I just appreciate the opportunity to be able to be with you today. By way of introduction, the Northwest Seaport Alliance is a partnership between the ports of Tacoma and Seattle for the joint management of our marine cargo operations. The two ports remain independent port authorities, but they primarily are managing lines of business unrelated to marine cargo on their own. So, for example, the Port of Tacoma happens to manage their industrial properties down on the Tacoma Tide Flats on their own. The Port of Seattle might operate, let's say, SeaTac Airport on their own. The marine cargo operations, however, have been brought together to be jointly managed by the two ports through the Northwest Seaport Alliance. Marine cargo flowing through the Northwest Seaport Alliance facility supports an estimated 58,400 jobs and generates over $4 billion of wages here in the central Puget Sound area. We also generate more than $250 million in state tax revenue, supporting a variety of programs, everything from K-12 education to social services, environmental programs, transportation investments, economic development investments, and what have you. I really appreciate the chance to be able to talk about the supply chain issue. The majority of my comments are going to be focused on international trade and waterborne cargo, but I think the reality is that the supply chains are breaking all throughout the system. Even products that might be grown and manufactured here in the United States for consumption in the United States, even those supply chains are experiencing problems. So I wouldn't describe this as uniquely a ports issue, it's just a larger supply chain issue. But again, the majority of my comments are going to focus primarily on that marine cargo space. So I am going to share a slide, and this is something that was put together by the American Association of Port Authorities. And I think it does a good job of sort of outlining the complexity of the supply chain and some of the many problems that are disrupting things. Everything from spending extremes to issues with trucking to port worker shortages, et cetera. If I were, though, to hyper simplify what is going on right now, I would say that this is a classic disruption in the supply and demand. So first of all, let's talk on the demand side of things. Consumption in the United States has fundamentally changed over the last 18 months because of COVID. We are no longer consuming things, we are consuming services. We are no longer consuming going to the gym, for example, and paying for a gym membership. We are now buying a Peloton bike for our home to work out at home. We're no longer going out to restaurants. We're buying a Le Creuset set because we're now baking bread at home. And we're not going on vacations. We are now taking care of that remodel or taking care of the home office because we're all working remotely or working from home. The consumption of goods has shot up through the roof. Trans-Pacific trade between Asia and North America has shot up in the last year by 30% over pre-pandemic levels. In addition to just simply buying more things, the way we are buying things has changed. Before, we would provide free labor to retailers by driving to the mall, driving to Macy's to buy a sweater or a suit or whatnot. Now we are wanting the stores to come to us. We want Amazon or Target to deliver goods directly to our front porch. And more importantly, we want it done in one day. That creates new demands on the supply chain and new demands for new types of supply chain infrastructure. So in addition to that demand, we are also seeing that the supply, primarily the supply of workers, has plummeted. And that extends all throughout the supply chain. Factories in China or Vietnam, for example, are opening and closing because of COVID infections. Or when they are reopened, social distancing is required. So you don't have maybe as many workers in that factory. And you see similar stories all throughout the supply chain. We saw for a period of time that the largest port in China shut down for a full month because of COVID restrictions. We see warehouses and distribution centers experiencing similar sorts of challenges as well. In addition to that, we are also seeing the Great Resignation take place. Now, many of us, if you've looked at articles, probably see this taking place primarily in the hospitality industry. I think we've all seen stories about the struggles restaurants may be experiencing to get waiters and waitresses to come back to work. Well, we're experiencing those same challenges within the supply chain as well. We are seeing that low-skilled or underskilled workers have far more clout within the labor market than they used to. They are now have choices, and they're now asking themselves, do I really want to continue in this job? Do I want to continue, for example, to drive truck when I have to go out and get a CDL? I need to maybe pay for the regular maintenance of my truck, or do I maybe instead want to go drive a local delivery van for UPS or Amazon or whatnot? That way I can go home every night. I don't have to spend the night on the road. Maybe I don't want to work in a warehouse. Maybe I want to work in a local fulfillment center that is right in my neighborhood. We're all competing for the same types of workers. And so because of that, you're seeing the whole supply chain sort of getting bollocksed up. So what does that look like here in Washington State? Well, the good news is it's not as bad as we see in other parts of the country. I think we've all seen the national television programs, which show really impressive film footage about this fleet of ships off the coast of LA and Long Beach, where you are seeing 40, 50, 60 ships at anchor waiting to get into port. The good news is it's not that bad here in the Pacific Northwest. At our peak, we've seen about 12.5 vessels waiting at anchor. We have been averaging between a dozen and dozen and a half. More recently, those numbers have begun to dip slightly. We are now between a half dozen to a dozen vessels that are at anchor. We are seeing that they are in various different locations. They are not necessarily all in Elliott Bay or Commencement Bay, where the two ports are located at, because you're dealing with natural deep water harbors that in the case of Commencement Bay is 600 feet deep, so you don't really have an ability to drop anchor there. We are now seeing the vessels starting to appear in anchorages that have not been used since World War II. Anchorages off the southern tip of Bainbridge Island, off the coast of Whidbey Island, as by way of example. We are also seeing mountains of containers piling up in our harbors. So if you have not been down to our ports recently and you were to drive down there today, you would be shocked. You would see just mountains and mountains of containers stacked all over the terminals, and indeed on practically every flat piece of ground in our industrial areas. We are seeing backlogs of trains that are headed out of the Pacific Northwest to the East Coast. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50% of the cargo that comes into Seattle and Tacoma is in fact destined for locations in the American Midwest or the East Coast. And we have seen examples where there have been up to 22 full unit trains stuck in line trying to get into Chicago, but they're unable to do so because the rail ramps are clogged and congested with cargo. And so you're seeing massive backups in that particular space. So the question then is, well, what can we do about this? There are some things that the Northwest Seaport Alliance is able to do. It's important to note, though, that we've got limited authority to directly impact that supply chain. We don't run the terminals on a day-to-day basis. We are primarily a landlord port. We lease them to marine terminal operators, so we don't get to make the decisions about how things go on a day-to-day basis. But we can try to bring about influence, and we try to bring creative solutions to the table. One thing that we are doing is that we're going to be bringing a brand new container terminal to service in January. This is Terminal 5, located in Seattle, more specifically at the base of the West Seattle neighborhood. We have been in a multi-year process of modernizing that container terminal. We've invested over $300 million into that project, and that is going to be coming online in January. This is the only new container terminal that is coming back into service at this time anywhere on the West Coast. So that's really going to be able to provide us with a leg up. In addition to that, we have been looking at some of our excess wharf space to be able to provide lay berth locations for vessels so that they don't have to be bobbing off the coast of Washington. They can come in, they can come to port, which is a much safer location as opposed to being hit by the winter storms. I think many of us saw the story from 3 or 4 weeks ago when the bomb cyclone hit Western Washington and the Zim Kingston lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 containers off the side of the vessel. So being able to bring them in and be able to get them to dock is going to be important from a safety perspective. We've also tried to provide additional surge capacity. Any piece of flat industrial ground that the ports own that we are able to in turn lease out for off-dock container surge space, we've done that. So again, if you were to drive around the harbors, you would see, again, not only the mountains of containers on the terminals, you would also see them on other locations in the area. And we are in fact continuing to look to acquire additional property to provide additional surge capacity. In addition to that, we have been working on a daily basis trying to coordinate the different actors. We are talking every single day to the Class 1 railroads. We're talking every day to beneficial cargo owners, the Targets, the Walmarts, the Home Depots of the world, the Anderson Hayes of the world that own the cargo that is actually in the containers. We're working with the terminal operators. We're working with the ocean carriers, trying to look for efficiencies and synchronize our efforts and coordinate that. There are times where maybe a beneficial cargo owner contacts us and can't get access to their container on the terminal. We'll work with that terminal operator to make sure that that container can get pulled and delivered to the particular customer. We're also having conversations about extended gate hours. Now, there were a lot of headlines a month ago where the Biden administration announced that the Port of LA was going to be open 24/7. Unfortunately, that actually has not come to reality. And part of the reason for that is that even if your terminals are open later, that doesn't really make a difference if there isn't a place for the cargo to go. If the warehouse is closed at 5 o'clock, or if the warehouse is congested, or if the warehouse doesn't have manpower to be able to unload the containers, being open later at the terminal side doesn't help you achieve anything. We are trying to get some extended gate hours so we can get a little bit more movement. More importantly, we're working with the terminal operators to get predictable extended gate hours so that instead of a last minute notification of, hey, we're going to have extended gate hours tomorrow night, we're trying to make it a little bit more predictable to help everyone to be able to plan. So that's a few things that we are working on. Lastly, I would note that there are things that both our cities, state, and federal government can be doing to help. Now, an analogy I've been using is that this is a lot like a heart attack. And when you're in the midst of the heart attack, there is a limited amount of things that the victim can do at that moment. But that heart attack serves as a wake-up call for folks to remind them that it's important to quit smoking and go on a diet and eat better. Similarly, there may not be a lot of things that the state or federal government can do to bring in about immediate changes, let's say in the next month or two. But this should serve as a wake-up call for our policymakers to think about the health of the supply chain. Far too long, we've taken it for granted, much like I think a lot of times we take for granted electricity. We just assume that the power will come on if I flip the light switch, or the water will run when I turn on the faucet. Same sort of thing. We just take it for granted that this stores will always be stocked. And we think it's important for policymakers to be thinking about things that they can do to address the long-term health of the supply chain. We've developed a number of different policy ideas that I'm more than happy to share and discuss. But I think at this point in time, what I would like to do is just to sort of wrap things up and to turn it over to the other speakers, and then ultimately would be more than happy to answer questions that the group might have.
The name of our company is Corporate Management Group. My connection with Washington is I actually started out my career out of college with a Seattle-based company, a company called Airborne Freight. I was with them for about 8 years. I then moved over. I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, so a lot of aircraft industry there, and so we did a lot of work with the Boeing company, big Boeing plant in Wichita. I now live in Charleston, South Carolina. There's a big Boeing plant just about 10, 15 miles down the road. So familiar with the aircraft industry, and that's my connection to Washington. Our company's Corporate Management Group, most people know us by CMG. We've been around 35 years. My whole career has been around the freight industry. I mentioned I started with Airborne while I was in college. My job was loading planes with freight to move it out of the Wichita area. So I built my whole career around freight, and understanding that the supply chain is in a mess right now. There are many components that make up supply chain. The component that we concentrate on, that CMG concentrates on, is the freight aspect of it. So I want to talk a little bit about the freight piece of it, understanding that in the supply chain situation as we have today, that you're having trouble even getting freight, even getting your product, whether it be raw materials, whether it be finished goods, inbound, or domestically, even getting them out the door to your customers or wherever they need to go. So I have spoken throughout the country, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the way we look at freight. Hopefully y'all can see my screen, right? Can you all hear me?
We can,
Okay.
Marv. Thanks very much.
So what we put together, something I've talked about many times through different manufacturing associations throughout the country, is what we call the color of freight. And I've got a little blip here that says the freight may turn gray at times. And what I mean by that is the freight industry historically And I'm a historian of where the freight came from, all the way back to the stagecoaches. But the freight industry historically has always tried to not give you a clear picture of what the freight industry is all about, what they're doing. So they keep it gray, and many people don't want to mess with the grayness. So a lot of people turn to us to help them understand. So let me kind of go through here. Little crayons. Just so going back a little bit, freight deregulation, 1980. This is back in the Jimmy Carter era. It was supposed to create competition. It did. A lot of the carriers were very slow in addressing this. Supply chain bottlenecks. This isn't new. What we've seen today isn't really that new. It's been going on for a while. The carriers are terrific at playing whatever it is they want to create at the moment. One time it was insurance surcharges. At one time it was, today is fuel surcharges. Today is reduced capacity. Reduced capacity means there's not as many trucks to move your freight as there is freight moving around the world. And that applies both internationally and domestically as well. I'm sure Sean and I can have some conversations on capacity international, some of the games we're seeing being played. There's a new feature out in the industry from about 10 years ago. It's called accessorials. I've got here is what we call accessorial buffets. FedEx, UPS both have well over 800 different surcharges, or what we call accessorial charges they can hit you with. And it's the fastest growing revenue stream they have, more so than their actual freight cost. Then the carriers market, more regulation. We're going more back toward regulation that we had back in 1980. We have some private tariffs that are being thrown around, and then absolute confusion. And that's what we see more than anything within our client base. As we talk with new potential clients, we just see an awful lot of confusion within the freight industry and what they're doing. CMG is a freight management company. I want to make sure you understand that. We're not a logistics company, and we're very adamant about not being a logistics company. We're not a freight broker. We're not a truck line. We're not Krispy Kreme donuts logistics company. I laugh because everybody wants to use the term logistics, and as I have spoken different places, one of the questions I might ask is, tell me what your interpretation of logistics is, and we get 10,000 different answers. When I look at a client, this is the way that we kind of look at what somebody's doing. This is a pie chart, talks about the different pieces of what your freight spend looks like. You have vendor management, you have the inbound side, you have outbound distribution, you may have intercompany, you may have a plant in Washington, you may have a plant in Mississippi. A lot of our clients have multiple locations. You have process improvements. 99% of all people want to look at this piece called rates. That's the piece they look at. What's my rate? And to us, that's important, but it's not the most important. The data is very, very important. We have a very dynamic reporting system. We'll dice and slice your piece of freight so many different ways. Process improvements can be everything from why is my vendor shipping me 5 shipments a day instead of 1 bill of lading? It could be why are they using a truckload carrier to move a 15-pound box? There's a lot of different things that make up process improvements. But as you can see, 20% of the opportunity we see with any client is in process improvements. And then the rates as well too. Capacity and competition and supply chain bottlenecks. For me, being in the freight industry as long as I've been into it, having seen what the carriers may come across with as things that they can kind of sell, capacity is one of them. We see a little bit of the capacity issues. We don't see as much as everybody seems to think there is. On the truckload side, on the LTL side, on the small package side, Sean mentioned that we're going more and more to delivery to our house. We're seeing the same things. We work with eBay to help them get their stuff through the systems. We help them with some technology. So just because your carrier can't give you the pickup, give you the capacity, there's a lot of options besides your carrier. Accounting numbers. This is something that we work a lot with our clients. An accounting will book the freight based on when they get the invoice, most likely. We don't look at it that way. We look at the actual ship date. Because of that, your accounting numbers, when you do your accruals at the end of the month or the end of the year, may not match up to hours, but we want to know the days that things happen. And by the way, customs duties is not a freight issue. I mean, it is an issue for you, but it's not a freight issue. And one of the other things is when you allow your supplier to prepay the freight and bill it back to you, what you're really doing is giving your supplier an opportunity to make profit off your freight. So we highly encourage our clients not to allow that to happen, but there's a couple ways that they'll do it, and they want to make some money off their freight. Operational numbers based on, again, on actual ship dates. Freight audits, if you're not having your freight bills audited, I'm talking about domestic, international, whether it's LTL or truckload or small package, then you're leaving some dollars on the table. There is not any carrier that is 100% accurate on their billing practices. And they're not going to tell you to go find it. They're not going to tell you how to go find it, but we're telling you it's there. We've seen some pretty significant dollars by just having your freight bills audited, and it pays for itself. These are some metrics that I kind of threw out here that people look at. A lot of people look at freight as percent of sales. And these are some different industries, and the typical percentages of what the freight as a percent of sales might be within that industry. So most companies look at freight as percent of sales. As you do your financials, you've got a line item that says freight on it. And what's the freight and how does it match up against my topside sales? The next one is some companies will go as low as what's my freight inbound cost as a percentage of cost of goods. And to me, this is a good benchmark as well too. The inbound side, the purchasing group, the procurement side, they want to look at how much freight they're incurring to get their products into what they're doing. So this is a kind of a second level. Companies will look at their freight. Economic forecast. I highlighted 2022 based on the experts and what they're saying. Projected freight cost will increase 7.9 to 11.2. Why is there such a spread? Because each one of you is different. Each one of your freight spend is different from everybody else. Is it made up of mostly small package? Is it made up of truckload? What makes up your freight spend is 90% of it inbound. So what CMG does, it will pull it into its reporting system and give you a snapshot of what your freight spend looks like, but it'll be somewhere between 7.9 and 11.2. If you're able to manage that, if you're able to get your arms around that, we see it about 1.7 to 2.3. Many cases, many cases, we're able to help our clients reduce freight, but even if it's managed, it's still going to be a little bit of an increase for you. I just threw in this, this is some reporting we do. I must have picked up the wrong one. Hold on a second, I'm gonna get you into a different thing here. Bear with me. Yeah. Okay. I actually wrote up the wrong one.
Technical difficulties.
Yeah, I actually put it the wrong one. One of the things I do, one of the things that CMG does is we do some blogs. And one of the things that I throw out there that I just think is really cool is something called freight myths. I want to kind of talk about a couple of these. Number one, I don't have inbound freight costs. My supplier pays them. You're absolutely killing yourself if you believe that. Vendors can prepay the freight, add it back onto your cost of goods invoice. They will always mark it up. Secondly, you may not see a freight cost on your cost of goods invoice. It's bundled up into the cost of goods. What we do in that case, we'll unbundle that cost. Example is we did a 3-year group with Compact, the computer people, and they were bringing steel out of Chicago, and we negotiated with the vendor on what we call a freight allowance. I think we got $2.75 per 100 pounds for it. We got the carriers for $1.75 per 100 pounds. It ended up being a 6-figure income for Compact, to the point they were actually budgeting it every year. So there's different ways on the inbound side. I'm getting good rates. My LTL discount's 90%. One of the biggest mistakes companies will make. I'll hear somebody say, I have good rates. I get 90%. 90% from what? And just here to tell you that LTL carriers, and this is where this is coming from, LTL carriers will have 3 different tariffs they can use with you. And if your shipping guy has trouble spelling freight, he gets this rate base and you get 90% off that. If he can spell freight, then he gets a lower rate base, which means you save a little bit of money. And if he can spell freight in 7 different languages backwards, then he gets this particular rate base. So you got to be really careful when you say I'm getting a 90% discount, because they'll base it on how well you know how to spell freight. CMG, by the way, operates off 1994 rates. So everybody operates off the same thing. And by the way, if you're using 5 LTO carriers, you have the possibility of having 15 different rate bases that you're using. So all of our clients are on a single rate base, everybody comes off the same page. When I file a claim, my carrier will reimburse me for the full amount, including my profit. Absolutely not going to happen. There's a couple of things you got to weigh in on. Is in today's freight industry, they've gotten very, very smart. They'll only reimburse a percentage of what your claim is for, and they're certainly not going to reimburse you for the profit part of it. An example might be, if you've got a shipment that you sent out and it got damaged or lost, and the value of that shipment was $900, it very well could be that your claim that the carrier by law has to reimburse you is 50 cents a pound, which takes out to $212. So you end up losing. There's ways to get around that, but you got to be smart enough to address it at the get-go. But this is very, very important. It's easier just to hand everything over to a 3PL and they'll save me some money. Most likely, a 3PL can probably save you some money, but can they save you the most amount of money? And the answer is no. It doesn't make sense for them to do that because it cuts into their revenue stream as well too. Our philosophy is let's manage the freight, let's control it ourselves. In the case of CMG, all of our clients, and you would recognize many of our clients. In our case, our clients see us as 1099 employees. They pay us a retainer. That's all they pay us. It's our salary, but we're part of their management team and we help them insource it so they can help control their freight costs. All LTL carrier pricing is the same. Absolutely not. There are so many nuances within a carrier's pricing scheme that you got to be careful. They don't use the same rate base. Their discounts might say the same, but their accessorial charges might be different. I don't know if any of you have any one product, either incoming or outgoing, that exceeds 8 feet, but in today's market, happens within the last 60 days, you're going to get an additional accessorial charge because it's over 8 feet. One of the carriers charges you $3,000 extra per shipment. So you're going to be careful. We also publish a blog called Top 3 Freight Mistakes almost every company makes. Not shopping around. This pertains both to truckload. Truckload is, in the truckload world right now is being controlled by freight brokers. And it's on a day-to-day, whatever the market shows for that day. So in many cases, you may have to get a different rate today as you get 3 days from now. But if you don't do it, then they're going to charge you whatever they can. Going with the same carrier used to be the way to go, the person who you could work with. But in terms of dollars and cents, it's definitely not the way to go in today's market. Bill of lading areas. This is the one that I really enjoy working with. Your bill of lading you issue on a shipment going out of your facility is a legal document. And on that legal document, there's some required fields. Let me just take the example of LTL. LTL shipments are rated on what we call classes. Each one of your product is assigned a particular class. And if you have a box of mixed goods, it'll be mixed classes. If you don't list those classes on the bill of lading to include the appropriate description for it, if your product is normally a class 60, then the carriers, because your bill of lading is not made out correctly, has the opportunity to default to a 175. So you can imagine going from a class 60 rate to a class 175 is a huge jump. And the carriers love to do that. They have, all LTL carriers have a group within the organization called W&I. That stands for Weight and Inspections. The W&I departments of all LTL carriers have become profit centers for them. These guys look for ways to charge you extra because you can't make out a bill of lading. We do a lot of intermanagement with, we see an overclass shipment coming into one of our clients. We reach out to the supplier. As crazy as this sounds, we help them understand how to make out a bill of lading. We help them understand to make out a bill of lading to show what they're shipping, something they should be doing. Mismanaging claims. We talked a little bit about claims and not getting paid for the full amount. This really kind of goes back to freight terms. And I'm going to talk about the domestic term. We can talk about international terms if you want to, but domestic terms, you probably all recognize something called FOB. FOB is freight free on board. FOB terms are not freight, but they are your buying terms. So if you issue a PO to ABC supplier and you say, I want it to be FOB origin, once that shipper creates that bill of lading, tenders it to the carrier, it's no longer their shipment, it's yours. If there's something that happened along the route, it gets damaged or lost, you're responsible for filing that claim. We encourage our clients to go FOB destination, freight collect. That means that the ownership of that product, which has nothing to do with freight, the freight cost, ownership of that freight is your vendor's until it reaches your back door and you sign off on it. So if there's a claim to be had, it's your supplier that needs to file that claim. Again, it has nothing to do with freight charges. You can do FOB destination freight prepaid or freight collect, whatever's best for yourself. And that kind of gives you just an overview of some of the things we see in the domestic side of the world. We can talk a little bit about international if you want to, but any questions I can answer?
I am going to start off with a question from one of our manufacturing members who isn't able to be here today. And I'm going to ask either Sean or Marv to answer this. I know that you can't control what goes on in terms of customs. Is there any advice that you can offer to help speed up that process? We have one manufacturer who's, waiting and waiting and waiting for a container to be offloaded in the port in LA, and then it gets hung up in customs. Is there anything else that they can do that will help that process?
So if I can go first, let me just talk some high level stuff, but I think this is something that ultimately Marv would be best to hopefully be able to provide some advice on in terms of specific strategies. We are seeing sort of two issues taking place. First is even on the run up to the pandemic, we were seeing increasing pressure when it came to customs because of a lack of manpower. Congress has been historically underfunding customs. And so they've just not had the manpower there always to necessarily process all of the cargo. So we have spent a lot of time speaking with Congress about just ensuring there's got to just be resources there. Customs has two goals or two missions. One is certainly the aspect of providing security. There's a security component of this, but they also have a role to facilitate trade. And if you just don't have the manpower to be able to do the appropriate inspections and what have you, I mean, then you're not going to be facilitating trade. More recently, we have seen COVID just make things even more complicated. There are times, for example, that you might sit there and look at the terminals and say, help me understand, Sean, why isn't there a vessel at that berth there? Or why aren't all the cranes working? The reality is that there are certain points in time where we basically have to pause operations and carve out enough space for customs to be able to do their work. And again, things are just so congested, they don't even always have the elbow room to do the work that they are doing. So that's just kind of a higher level explanation of some of the challenges. I think in terms of a specific strategy, this is where I would want to turn it over to Marvin. Perhaps he might have a thought on that.
Yeah, Sean, good information. There is within customs, again, we don't view customs as part of our portfolio, but I do know Incoterms will play a part in what you're doing. That's the FOB of the international world. We see a number of clients that are moving over to an Incoterm called DDP. DDP means, this is some cost reductions for you. DDP means that your vendor controls the freight all the way until it reaches your back door, to include customs clearance. We're starting to see more and more of that. We've got a new client that does a lot of stuff out of Vietnam and China, and they've moved everything over they're doing to DDP. So it's your responsibility of your vendor to do it. Does that mean it gets through customs any faster? There are also some technology things you can do through customs to have your product cleared while it's in the air, while it's on the water, so that when it speeds through the ports, it'll get through a little bit faster. So I don't have the exact information on how you do it, but I know it's there. I've seen some of our clients take advantage of it. So some technology that you can get customs clearance before it ever lands to the port, air freight, and also the ocean freight. And then you can look at the Incoterms as well too. One of the advantages of using DDP, if you think about it, if you've got containers coming out of China, and what's the transit time, 23, 24 days now coming across the water, that's not your inventory. That's your vendor's inventory. And so you don't have to pay the inventory carrying costs for so many days. Just some advantages you can think of.
Great, thank you. So if I'm understanding you correctly, there really isn't any one answer to this problem. It's a chain of events that's happened and continues to happen. And do you foresee the congestion easing up at all? Is there, does it just take time? How do we resolve this?
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of those where when you overeat the meal, it just takes time for it to digest and work through the system here. And that's a little bit of what it's going to take. We have seen some signs where things look slightly better in the Pacific Northwest. I would say it's premature to tell whether or not we've just begun to see a bend of the curve, so I don't want to get too far over my skis here. But I think a lot of the forecasts that we are seeing is that this will continue to be a challenge into at least the second half of 2022. But part of that is just, it takes everybody doing a little bit more. So let me talk about rail just by way of an example. So at one point in time, one of the major carriers actually suspended service coming out of the West Coast to the American Midwest for a week just to allow for the clearance of the bottlenecks. Well, unfortunately, what they did is they just shoved the bottleneck further back up the line. Fortunately, now though, the two railroads are getting more resources to bear, more unit trains, more equipment, more manpower. And so what we now see is, at least in the case of Tacoma, we are seeing that they have been able to keep pace with the amount of inbound freight going out by rail. They've been able to keep pace with that more or less for the last several weeks. That's good news. Seattle rail was not doing that, but that has begun to turn around. And in fact, we have now been able to see is, for a period of time, we just saw inventories growing. We have now actually started to see that the inventories are now starting to come down, and they are starting to get through some of the backlog of what we call the intact intermodal cargo. The cargo that basically comes right off of a ship, goes directly onto a train to head out to, again, Minneapolis, Chicago, what have you. So that is one bit where you see some of that work taking place. The other part is we are seeing the carriers are now starting to do slow steaming out in the Pacific. I mean, they've been doing slow steaming for a period of time because of fuel costs. They have gotten really slow of the ships transiting. The bad news is that creates a little bit of a bunch up, but what that is now going to give time is for the terminal operators to work with the beneficial cargo owners to get the existing cargo cleared off the dock, right? We are also seeing other points in time where some of the carriers are bringing in ad hoc vessels into the terminal to take cargo that is going westbound back towards Asia and evacuating large swaths of containers. And just every time you're able to do something like that, you're just chipping away slowly at the problem and you're making progress. But one ad hoc vessel is not going to get through this, right? One additional unit train a week is a huge improvement, but that alone is not going to get there. So it's all of these little pieces coming together to eventually get to where I think a solution is at. Ultimately, though, like I said, this is a great wake-up call. It's a great wake-up call for all of us collectively be asking ourselves, are we as a society operating through, again, our government partners, doing what it takes to ensure that we have a healthy supply chain? And I think that is a good dialogue for us to be having at this time.
Yeah, I agree with Sean on the time period. It's going to be in 2022, probably second quarter or something like that, before you see a real significant improvement. And I think by the way, the backlog is all over the ports of the United States. They're seeing it here in Charleston, they're seeing it in Savannah, they're seeing it in Wilmington, North Carolina. So it just seems to be more intense out on the West Coast. It's all the ports right now. Domestically, there's a lot of good answers. Internationally, probably not as much right now. Although we're seeing some people chartering planes, chartering boats to bring some stuff over. That's pretty expensive stuff, though.
Great, thank you. Logan, did I see you raise your hand? Did you have a question you want to ask?
Yeah, thanks so much. And Sean, I love both the overeating and the heart attack analogies. It helps some of us digest here if we don't speak all the language. So thanks for that. I've got two questions. We do a lot of international shipments, both inbound for materials and outbound with finished product to international customers in Asia and South America. First question is just tied to rates. If we don't expect any relaxing of this challenge until late in 2022, should we expect the increased ocean shipping rates that we're seeing to stick around that long? And even from then forward, will they drop back down to levels that we've seen previously, or should we expect these increased rates to stay in the long term? And my second question, tied more to the inside our borders piece of this, is port deliveries from the port to and from a business like ours here in Seattle. You know, a lot of that challenge is based on domestic labor shortages, wage issues. You know, we're all familiar with that. Do we foresee that problem getting better later on in 2022, or is this something that we as a country are really still searching for the solution for?
So a couple observations here. You know, first thing I want to do is just actually take a step back and let's go into the Wayback Machine and take a look at the mid 2000s. At that point in time, we saw a surge in international trade, and it was just going up and up and up. Everyone just assumed good times were here permanently, a mistake that I think happens in all economies at some point in time in the history of the world. But everyone just assumed that the good times were here permanently, trade was going to grow forever. And so as a result, you saw a real overinvestment in the international shipping industry. Ocean carriers were buying more and more vessels, building bigger and bigger vessels. Everyone was building a brand new terminal, new ports were coming completely online. And then the Great Recession hit. And again, everyone realized that they had overbuilt. For many of us, the Great Recession ended in the early 2010s. For the ocean carriers, it almost never ended up until right before the pandemic. I read somewhere that someone described that the ocean carriers were going through the longest recession in the shipping industry since the Civil War. Ocean carriers up until recently were just losing billions and billions of dollars every year. And the question of who had the cloud, the beneficial cargo owners really had that clout at that period of time. And arguably many of us in the United States in particular were addicted to being able to go to Old Navy and get a cheap shirt and getting their overnight delivery from Amazon and so on and so forth. And so the ocean carriers, and in fact, the entire industry was spending this entire last decade trying to wring efficiencies out of the system. You saw carriers go bankrupt, they merged, they acquired one another. You saw terminals go dark. You saw ports coming together. Look at the Northwest Seaport Alliance as an example of that. And so to a certain degree, over the last year or two, some of the carriers in particular are finally getting a financial windfall, and they're trying to make up for that lost time. I think at the end of the day, this is not sustainable, right? I think at the end of the day, you're going to see the pendulum eventually swing back that other direction. I think for the short term, because of the imbalance between supply and demand, rates are going to remain high. Those rates are going to come back down to earth. What I cannot predict is whether or not the rates will be as cheap as they were before, at least in international shipping, when, again, the Walmarts, the Home Depots, the Targets of the world had a lot of clout and were really able to demand really low rates. So I don't know where it will land on the long term. I've just got to suspect that rates will remain high in the short term, and eventually they will level out to something. On the domestic side of things, I think, again, this is one of those things where, you know, in my mind, things always swing, right? And eventually we will get to a greater state of normalcy. I don't know how long it will take. I think it's going to, again, be at least 6-12 months at the earliest. And I don't entirely know what normalcy will look like, but I know that it's going to look more normal than it does today. Eventually that will swing back. And part of it may just be that, you know, folks are going to start paying their workers more. We're going to probably sit there and say, you know, not everybody is going to want to drive truck or work in a warehouse and perform arduous labor for a long period of time for you know, 10, 12, 15 bucks an hour, you know, you're going to end up needing to pay a premium. Where those numbers land, again, speculation on my part. And again, Marv might have some thoughts. He might have greater clarity given his proximity to the supply chain.
Yeah, Logan, I agree with Sean on the rates will never go back to where they were. Will they come down? Probably, again, maybe by the second quarter, you might see a little bit of relief on the international side. Again, on the domestic side, there are a lot more options. We see them every day. There are a lot more options that you'll have than you will on the international side. We work with the largest furniture retail stores in the country. And they supposedly have the third largest import of containers, and we've seen their numbers go up. So, I mean, there's leverage doesn't really play a part in this thing right now, I don't think. So, but domestically there are options, internationally not as many, unless you want to air freight everything in, and of course that's pretty darn expensive. So, probably not what you want to hear, right?
Of course not, but I appreciate the candor, guys. Thank you for answering that question.
If I can add one thing, and I think Marv raised an interesting aspect, and this is something I didn't talk about, but when you were looking at that slide that I had up before, you may have noticed, it's the question of air freight. Now, the Seaport Alliance does not deal with this sector. This is primarily managed individually by the Port of Seattle, but I think it's important to note one thing. The vast majority of air freight does not fly in dedicated freighter aircraft. It actually flies in the belly of passenger aircraft. So when you are flying to and from Alaska, you know, all of that salmon, the Copper River salmon, that's down in the hull of your passenger plane. And so when all of a sudden people stop going on vacation and flying around the United States or the world, you saw a pinch not just on the passenger side, but on the freight side as well. So I think that when people start moving around again and are again air travel picks back up, I think you're going to see some relief in the air cargo space as well, because there's just going to be, quite frankly, more places to put your, you know, Washington State cherries or your Copper River salmon or some other critical vital component. That may not be the answer for large, heavy things like furniture. It may not be the answer for low margin commodities, but it certainly becomes another part of the solution set.
Air freight is in two categories, Logan. You've got air freight partial and you've got air freight cargo. Air freight cargo being the bigger stuff. Both of them are treated separately, two different pricing components. So it really depends on, like I mentioned in the presentation, the data. The data, my people get tired of hearing me say the data will tell a story. Once we get the data in the system, it will tell that story. So.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Logan, thanks for the questions. Those are great. I have another question for you. We're currently seeing amongst our manufacturers a chip shortage, which was ostensibly originally attributed to the car manufacturing slowdown. Is there a component of freight and of shipping, whether it's by air or not, that has contributed to this shortage? And is there something, as the congestion is alleviated, that will improve chip availability? I've asked a stumper. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sean. I'll talk after you talk.
Yes and no. Yes, in that, you know, tightness in the supply chain is affecting everything, right? So does it have an impact on chips? Yes. But I think there are others that are far smarter about that sector than me. But from what I have read, a lot of it also comes down to a lack of investment, I would say particularly in the United States, but arguably globally, in that sector. And we have just seen a reduction in the number of manufacturers who produce these items. Reduction in the number of manufacturers, a growth in the demand for that product, and it's really getting consolidated in a handful of countries. And so, yes, I think easing of the supply chain may help, but maybe there is a conversation to be had about a larger, what is our larger manufacturing strategy around chips? And again, I would defer to a lot of other folks who are much more knowledgeable about that specific one, but it appears to me there's a conversation that needs to happen in that space.
I don't think there's any question that both the air carriers and the ocean carriers have gotten smarter this time around. If you remember, the airlines took some planes out of rotation, which means there was less capacity. And if you want to use my seat on my plane, you had to pay more. The ocean carriers have taken some ships out of rotation. The air carriers have taken some airplanes out of rotation. So to me, that has driven up costs as well.
Thank you. Which brings me to a point, Sean, that you started a little bit ago. What does a healthy supply chain look like so that we not only can come out of this current situation, but we try and mitigate what might happen to us again in the future?
So I think there's a number of things that we need to think about. One is, what does our industrial lands policy look like? And I'll focus, let's say, primarily on Washington State, but I think you could have this larger conversation elsewhere. We have seen, in particular in Seattle and Tacoma, encroachment on our industrial lands. We have seen, in some cases, a devaluing of our industrial lands. And if you're not making sure that you are protecting and enhancing those, you don't have that capability to be able to deal with surges like we have right now. The legislature several years ago amended the Growth Management Act to require the cities of Seattle and Tacoma to incorporate a container port element into their comprehensive plan. They've done that, but they haven't necessarily adopted all the regulations to fully implement. So thinking about things like that is one example. Thinking about transportation investments. It doesn't matter if we can quickly load or unload a vessel if the cargo can't get to and from the terminals, either because of congestion or failed bridges like the West Seattle Bridge in Seattle, or a half-built interchange at the Interstate 5 Port of Tacoma Road, interchange down in Tacoma. So thinking about transportation investments, thinking about having resources for multimodal freight investments. Usually when we talk about multimodal transportation investments, we think about bike ped, transit. Those are all well and good, that's fine, but a container, it can't fit on the back of a bike. And there are other types of multimodal investments we need to be thinking about. So examples of that might be helping to be able to, we're attempting to build a new off-dock facility in Tacoma, a multimodal facility, investments in things like that, investments in terms of berth deepening or fender repairs on our wharfs, what have you. So having financial resources to invest in there. Thinking about making sure that there are incentives and resources for environmental initiatives. We in Washington State have decided that we are going to have the strictest stormwater standards in the nation. We are also demanding that we have ports be very aggressive in reducing our air emissions. That's fine. Arguably, those are all important. But every dollar that is being spent on that is one less dollar to pay for an infrastructure investment that actually facilitates the movement of the cargo. So what are things that we can be thinking about in that space? Are there ways to be able to create financial incentives to move more cargo movements to off hours? So both in terms of, again, the extended gate hours I talked about, but also incentives for the warehouses to be open maybe in the middle of the night. That all costs money. And so what can we do to make that easier for folks in that space? Workforce development, are we doing the right things in that space? So those are just a couple of the examples of things we might think about from a policy perspective, again, state, federal, local level as well.
Barb, do you have anything you want to ring in on about what a healthy supply chain might look like?
To me, it's all about processes that you're doing. Transportation, again, where Sean is on the port side of everything and the international coming in and getting it out of the port. Again, we see a lot of things on the domestic side. It's not just an international situation as we see it today. We see a lot of things domestically. Sean brought up a point about Chicago being a bottleneck for the rail. That's an understatement. You might as well let it sit 5 or 6 days once it hits Chicago because it's not going anywhere. So transit time is very, very important, but costs are also very important. And as we look at this bottleneck we call supply chain, do we have to succumb to higher costs just because? And we're saying, no, you don't have to. So there are some opportunities, and again, I'm going to talk about the domestic side. There are some opportunities both in terms of service and in terms of cost. And again, I'll use the phrase that we use around here is the data will tell the story. Once we see the picture of what it looks like, we can be a little bit more definitive while we're trying to do.
So is there, we've heard conversations, and Sean, you just mentioned this about the warehouse is not open. As ports are open 24/7, not everybody else is. Is the trucker, the driver shortage, why is there a driver shortage? Just curious. Nobody's ever explained that to me.
Let me answer the question for you in one sentence. The average age of a truck driver in today's world is 63.
Ouch. Okay. Says enough. So are autonomous vehicles really impacting the trucking industry, or the upcoming advent of autonomous trucks?
So I think, yeah, I think you've got a number of factors that certainly come into play. One is again, you think about, driving truck is hard work. Now, it's not necessarily physically demanding, and in fact, there is an opportunity, I would say, within the trucking sector to see greater diversity from a gender standpoint in terms of drivers. It's not like the 1950s where the truck driver had to also go unload the truck, right? So you're not needing to deal with physical brawn. You just now need someone who can drive the truck. But do we make this as a career that looks appealing or not for folks? If you're spending the night on the road and there's not sufficient truck parking, for example, and so you're a person parked on some, intersection kind of on the side of the road, you may not feel very safe there. And I know male truckers who don't feel safe in that environment. Some female truckers may sit there and say, I feel, more unsafe. So thinking about truck parking is part of it. Salaries is part of it as well, right? It's just there's been a shortage there because the BCOs have been able to successfully demand really low rates up until recently here. And so so thinking about some of that, you see a graying of the sector, as Marv correctly pointed out. So the question on automation, I think it is still premature to see automation to be the solution. I'm unclear what that's going to look like. If it's going to play out, I think it's mainly in the long haul capacity as opposed to your local drays, delivery, things like that. But I got to admit, if I'm coming out of high school and I see a conversation about, oh, we're going to automate everything, I could sit there and say, why would I want to go into that career path, right? You're telling me it's a dead end job. So automation itself may not be impacting jobs today, but the discussion of it potentially could be. And this is where I would want to I don't want to defer to my good friends like with the Washington Trucking Association and others who are far more knowledgeable in that space. But we saw driver shortages before the pandemic. And again, I think everyone is sort of reassessing, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? And maybe trucking is not what people want to do. So we may have to figure out incentives to make sure people do want to pursue that career.
So trucking is there's about 3 components of trucking. The one that I came out of back in corporate life is this thing called private fleet. Most truck drivers want to drive for a private fleet because of the benefits, getting home more frequently. We have a number of clients, and private fleets used to be predominant in the industry 20 years ago, 25 years ago. 3PLs came on the market and they said, you know, you don't need to do that. Let us handle it for you. We're now seeing a resurgence of private fleets. And not only are they private fleets, but now private fleets can haul other people's freights. So as we look at the data of our clients and we say, okay, you're running your fleet out to these 6 states. By the way, we know there's freight coming from those 6 states back into your area at these really high rates. So now private fleet has become a profit center, but you got to have an appetite to do that. And it's not everybody has that appetite, but the opportunity is very definitely there.
It's an interesting turn of events, given how everything is changing because of the pandemic.
Yep.
So I have a different question for you from one of our members. And this really relates to the Port of Seattle. There's the congestion issue there. You said, Sean, that the Port of Seattle is starting to improve somewhat. Is that correct?
I was saying that the rail service going into the Seattle Harbor at the Northwest Seaport Alliance has been able to start to help bend that curve, you know, within the last week or two. Again, Tacoma had the rail service at Tacoma was staying, did not get as bad as the rail service up in Seattle, and has been able to keep pace longer. But now we've, like I said, we are seeing rail service starting to improve on that Seattle side to bend the curve.
Okay. So the question is this: has President Biden's appointed port envoy, John Pocari, reached out to the Port of Seattle yet? And will he be reaching out to foreign countries to discuss how to remedy their congestion, which in turn affects U.S. companies? Got any insights there?
Yeah, so the Northwest Seaport Alliance has been having some conversations with the Biden administration and with Pocari. I will admit that conversation has been somewhat limited. The bulk of the conversation between Pocari and the Biden administration has been with the ports of LA and Long Beach. They make up somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of that trans-Pacific trade. And so oftentimes that's where when people think about freight, that's where they go, or international freight, I should say, that's where they go. I mean, even look at what do you see on CBS and ABC News? It's always their reporters in LA, Long Beach. So have we had some conversations? Yes, not nearly to the degree or the amount of attention that LA and Long Beach have had.
And I assume have those conversations borne fruit, or are they just conversations?
I think they're still pretty in that conversational realm at this
Okay. Fair enough. So,
but I think, again, if you take a look, are there places that can be helpful and where the administration can be helpful? Yes. So I mentioned at one point in time that we have a project that we're trying to develop called the Port of Tacoma Off-Dock Container Yard. And what the concept behind that is to take certain types of services that are currently housed on a marine terminal and get them off that marine terminal, just so that you've got more elbow room for work to actually be the movement of the cargo through the terminal. So for example, empty containers. If you've got an empty container, if you could store it on this off-dock container yard, then you don't have to worry about a truck driver running the gauntlet to go get into the terminal to pick up an empty and head back out. mean, you don't need to do that on the terminal itself. Refrigerated containers, after a refrigerated container is used, it has to be washed out and sanitized per federal guidelines, sanitary guidelines. You don't need to do that on the terminal. You could do that off the terminal. You could store chassis at that site. So that's the type of uses that we're thinking about. We have submitted a PID, a federal PIDP grant. It's a Port Industrial Development Program, I think is the acronym, to get federal dollars for that. You know, if anyone with the Biden administration or USDOT is listening, it would be a great time for you to award that grant to that project, right? So, I mean, there's an example of things where the federal government could certainly be helpful.
Good.
John, we've actually suggested some of our clients move out of the Long Beach area and come up north a little bit. So we think it's probably
Thank you. Thank you.
Faster transit through there than through Long Beach right now.
So I want to, we've got a question from Randall. I heard there may be a port labor strike this month. Any update on that situation?
I am not aware of that, but to look on the horizon coming up here in the next, I should know this off the top of my head, next yearish or so, the West Coast labor contract will be finishing. So, and that will be up for renegotiation. So the way this works is that Longshore is represented by the International Longshore Warehouse Union, ILWU. The international headquarters is based in San Francisco. The employer side, all the terminal operators are a member of something called PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association. That serves as the negotiating arm for all the terminal operators. They negotiate a single contract for the entire West Coast. So all longshore between San Diego and Bellingham are a party of that contract. I would note that the ports, we are landlord ports. We are not members of PMA. It is our customers, the terminal operators, that are a member. So we unfortunately are sort of stuck on the sideline, but that contract is going to be wrapping up here in the medium future, and there is going to be a negotiation. I think from the Northwest Seaport Alliance's perspective, our perspective is we don't have a stake. We don't have an opinion on the specifics. We just want the two parties to come to an agreement sooner than later and to avoid disruptions. We know that the supply chain works only when all of the stakeholders and members of the supply chain are working together. So it is our hope that, again, terminal operators, ocean carriers, and labor can come to an agreement that is mutually beneficial for everybody involved.
Let us hope. Because of our location in the upper left corner, we rely on, our manufacturers rely on a lot of incoming raw materials. And we focused a lot today on the issue, the solutions about moving those raw materials through the ports faster. Is there anything, and Marvin, I'm going to throw this one at you. Is there anything in particular that you can suggest that will help our manufacturers as they send their finished product out domestically?
Again, there's a lot of options. Historically, the Northwest has always been the rates out of that particular part of the country, and depending on where it's going to, usually the Midwest, Southwest, Southeast, not so much Northeast, are favorable. So we just, you know, in summary, we can just take a look at what they're doing, where they're going to, the types of products they're shipping, whether it's going small package, LTL, truckload, whatever it may be. I hope nobody smacks me, but again, the data will tell that story specifically for that particular individual company. But generally, it's a pretty good opportunity coming out of that area, going to the rest of the United States. So,
Excellent. That may be why we don't have a lot of questions in that particular direction. We're experiencing the congestion part more than the other. We have just a few minutes left. Excuse me, if anybody in the audience has any other questions, this would be a good time to share them. And I also want to come back to Marv, you and Sean, if you have any kind of other comments you want to make to wrap things up. This has been very informative.
For me, it's been very good. Thank you for the opportunity. I enjoy doing these. I do these with other manufacturing associations throughout the country. And so I'm hearing the same thing across all spectrums. Everybody's kind of concerned about their cost, their service. Can I get my raw materials? Can I get my finished goods to send out to my customers? It's a pretty common theme across the United States right now.
Well, it's sort of good to know we're not alone, but you know, Logan, I think you had another question.
Sure, one more quick one, and it's about whether or not we're alone in this. You know, based on disrupted shipping schedules around the globe, to what degree are other international markets experiencing the same port congestion problems and delays? So, you know, if we have competitors in Europe or customers in South America, you know, in addition to what we're seeing on the US end in our ports, are they experiencing similar effects in their respective locations?
I'm hearing it out of Europe. I'm hearing it out of India. My guess is probably a number of places right now. So, but I am hearing out of Europe, Amsterdam, out of India. So,
yeah, and I can't speak with a great level of authority on that, though I certainly do know that you see, again, disruptions within Asia, within their supply chain, and recognizing again that if you are a manufacturer of a component in Asia that's coming to the United States, you are likely also a manufacturer of a component that's going to other locations around the globe. And so where there's a supply chain challenge there, I presume that there is a ripple effect to other parts of the globe as well. I can't speak necessarily to whether or not, again, the impacts are as great in those other continents as here in North America. But I've just got to imagine there is some impact happening.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
And I was going to say, just as a final thought, again, thank you everyone for providing us with an opportunity to be able to be with you and speak today. Ports are very weird, strange types of governments. We are probably, in some respects, the most visible form of government. If you drive along I-5, you just look out the window and you can see our facilities there in Tacoma or Seattle, and yet we are the least understood. Because unless you have an opportunity to drive around DeSoto or have an opportunity to drive around the Tacoma tide flats, you just kind of see the cranes in a distance, but you're not sure kind of what's going on. And so having an opportunity to come out and tell the story and sort of explain the complexity of this and the challenges we are having, I mean, we very much welcome it. Certainly would want to say that if people have other thoughts or perspectives or questions or need more information, again, I put our contact information within the chat. Feel free to reach out to me offline, or feel free to visit our website. We've got a lot of valuable information on there from an operations standpoint, everything from ship schedules, turn times. You can actually see if you've got cargo going in and out of the terminals. You have an ability to see kind of what the current queue times are for the truckers, what the see actual cameras showing the gate, so you just see what's going on down there. But again, we are happy to try and do what we can to address your supply chain needs. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today.
Excellent. Well, by the way, I'm Elizabeth Harris. I am on the board of CAMPS, and I am also the chair of the events committee. And I want to thank you on behalf of CAMPS for being here today. Marvin with CMG, and Sean with the Northwest Seaport Alliance. Thank you both very much. And I want to thank Tommy Gantz, who is our co-sponsor with us today from the Association of Washington Business. And we have another event coming up with you in December. Tommy, we have just another minute or so. Do you want to talk about that just a little bit?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth, again for partnering with us on this series. Our event is on December 8th at 2 p.m. and we'll be sending over some information to, I believe, Stacy shortly from our events team with some additional details. If you'd like to register for this event, you can go to awb.org and follow the links to that event. We do have an events page.
Excellent. We're looking forward to that coming up in December. So I think that is going to wrap us up for today. Thank you all for being here. We got you out on time too. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.